When we read from the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we must be careful, read wisely. These are not scientific nor historical stories. These are stories that narrate cosmic origins. They're told to provide answers to the big questions about life, while also seeking to tell us how and why things are the way that they are for us now. Following a scholar, Joseph Campbell, these stories are myths. Not myth in the way that we often think of it as just false, but instead myth in the way that they are poetic narratives that help us imagine our nature and our situation in life. Genesis 3, as we've just heard the last 5 verses of it, is a myth that gets to some of those deeper truths. Questions like, why is life struggle? Why do we have to work so hard? Why does childbirth hurt so much, or so I'm told? In the story, before they were banished from the garden, the first humans had it all. A paradise home. No need to toil for the sake of eating. Daily strolls with God through the cooler parts of the day. It was all good, good, good. There were hardly any rules either. In fact, there was only one. Don't eat from that tree. We know how the story went. And today we pick up after they ate the forbidden fruit and then were found out, and then given the consequences of their actions. As Adam and Eve were then banished from the garden, they were not only displaced from home, they also lost a sense of innocence. Indeed, they had a newfound kind of knowledge that they did not have in the garden place. But even that knowing included that someday they were going to die, and that the tree of life, which could have assured for them a sense of immortality, that they could have evaded death, would no longer be within reach ever again. If we could take a bit of liberty and imagine these characters in this mythic story, if we could look upon their faces as they looked back at Eden just one last time, as they stepped into a new world for the very first time, we might recognize some disillusionment in their eyes, shame upon their faces, their whole being overwhelmed in a kind of shock at what had been and what is to come. But just maybe they still had a glimmer of hope for what once was, but could no longer be. So the one who was made out of the dirt, and the one who would be the mother of all living, were banished. But as the myth has it, their toil and pain was not just struggle. It wasn't to be entirely devoid of joy. In fact, the two would welcome and experience new life in uncharted terrain. But instead of living in the safety and the security of Eden, they would make their home east of Eden, left to chart new paths in unfamiliar places. But nonetheless, new life will emerge from those places. For Eve indeed was the mother of all life, and as quickly as the next verse after our reading from Genesis, she bore a son, Cain. And by the next verse, there was a second child, his younger brother, Abel. As we might know the story, it was quickly after that, though, that the joy of new life led to the first taste of mortality. Death had entered the world as Cain took the life of his younger brother Abel. But the story went on, more and more descendants, more people experiencing the struggle of life and the joy in the midst of it as well. Life and toil. It was the way of this uncharted terrain beyond the bounds of Eden. That is, until one unique descendant of Adam and Eve came along. This one was a special child. As Luke chapter 3 lays out his genealogy, it works back to the beginning of this mythic family. It says Jesus was the son of Adam, the son of God. And like his forebears, all of them, Jesus too was tempted. But unlike Adam and Eve, his temptation didn't come in the lush paradise of Eden, where quite frankly it would have been easy to say no. But his temptation came about in a wilderness place where any comfort at all, any ease would have been quite nice. Like those first parents, though, he knew what it was to forge out new paths in places that were uncharted terrain. But while Adam and Eve were banished from the cool and the comfort of fellowship with God, for Jesus, it was God's Spirit who led him into and through the unfamiliar terrain as he spent 40 days. A number that harkens us back to the Hebrews, 40 years in the midst of the wilderness, reminding us that God's people often find themselves in uncharted terrain. In this wilderness, Jesus faced the tempter's wiles, as well as the fatigue of his own physical limitations. And from that wilderness, Jesus became the companion of all who must wander uncharted terrain. Jesus went there first, so he can accompany us through the midst of uncharted terrain. He is our guide. We might recall, before we get to that point, though, the details of his wilderness wandering. Through the long days of lack, the tempter offered ways out to him. And not bad things, quite good things at that. Things that seemed righteous, things that had a scriptural basis for doing them. Turn this rock into bread, he was told. Oh, how good the smallest morsel of bread would have tasted to the famished tongue. Second, bow down before the tempter, and you have an easy path to power and control over all the earth's kingdoms. That'd have been an easier track than the one Jesus chose, indeed. Third, throw yourself off the height of the temple pinnacle and let God send enough angels to pad your fall that your feet never hit the ground. I could imagine in that moment of isolation and loneliness how good it would have felt to have all of heaven attend to you in that moment, to be reminded you're not alone. But of course, Jesus didn't take any of the temptations. He knew a nourishment that was more fulfilling than bread made from stones could ever provide. He knew the high cost of worshiping the tempter. He knew that he would not put the God of life to the test. But he also knew who he was And he knew what mattered the most to him. So from that unknown and precarious place in the wilderness, Jesus still offers us a way through the midst of our uncharted terrain. He's clear on what matters most. But as the tempter knows, this is something any of us can forget when the unfamiliar becomes uncomfortable. But Jesus was clear on his values. He knew the importance of his relationship to God, and he knew that it all mattered more than the cheap comforts of substitutes and shortcuts. He lived a life firmly rooted in the trust of a God who sustains us. In the midst of uncharted terrain of the wilderness, Jesus shows us just how important faithfulness can be. And as the one who walked through the wilderness, he continues to be our guide through the unknown. Like those mythic first parents, as we still make our journeys east of Eden. In the span of my life, the terrain seems even less familiar than when I started this life. Temptation has not gone away, but neither has the possibility of goodness in life. But we are entering a terrain that none of us have ever experienced before. It requires us to ask questions that no human has ever had to entertain in the past. With the capability and the rapid growth of technology in this world, we are forced to entertain some existential questions that we have never had to address. Like, what happens when AI makes it so that a human workforce is obsolete and no longer necessary? What do we do when we're not needed? Or how do we live in peace in a world that is shrinking through globalization? It's amazing the ways that things happening a world away have profound bearing on our lives here. And how do we love our neighbor when climate change threatens all of us? And as much as we may talk about migration as an abstract conversation, we may experience climate disasters in our lives that make migrants out of any or all of us. Those lead to some big questions. And it isn't just life out there either. As the world rapidly changes, what is the church's role in a changed and ever-changing world? In the past, people knew the central place of the church to order their lives. But I'm sorry to tell you, that Eden is no more. And we are forced to navigate new terrain. As jarring as all of that may seem, though, my intent is not to scare you this morning, but rather to remind you that we are not the first ones to walk through uncharted terrain. Jesus is our companion and our guide through the unknown places. And his wisdom is exactly the wisdom we need to guide us right now. Let us learn of his ways, particularly the way he wandered through wilderness places. Let us be clear, as he was, of who God has called us to be. Let us not pretend, but let us acclimate ourselves to the uncharted terrain in which we find ourselves. Let us embrace the call to courage and clarity that is not a nice thing, but is essential for people who seek to remain faithful through the midst of the unknown. And friends, let us remember with the psalmist that in the midst of it all, God is our refuge and our strength. God is a present help in the midst of trouble. Let us not be afraid, even though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though the waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. Even in this uncharted terrain, we don't go it alone. And we are not without the wisdom of Jesus, our good guide. Thanks be to God. Amen.